Callum wasn't sure why his mornings always began with some variation of, "Oh, this should be good." But here he was, arm deep in a garbage chute, pulling out what looked like a mechanical arm with more enthusiasm than he had for most things in life. Welcome to Etherian, the post-human temple city where dreams went to die, and all you could do was watch them rot, while hoping the stench of divine garbage didn't cling to you too long. "Morning, Callum." A voice wheezed through the static of a barely functioning comm device. It was Rick's, the closest thing Callum had to a friend, if you could call a guy who owed you 10 credits and always forgot to pay up a friend. "Rick's," Callum grunted, trying to ignore the sharp jab of metal against his ribs. "Tell me why I'm doing this again." Rick's chuckled, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Because you're a pacifist, and this is the least aggressive way to get back at the universe for screwing you over." Callum tugged the mechanical arm free with a victorious flourish that ended with him almost toppling backwards. "Yeah, well, I think the universe got one over on me again. This thing's heavier than my will to live. Just don't let the Ithar catch you in their holy pits," Rix warned. "High Cleric Zargoth's not keen on humans treating their sacred scrapyards like malls." "No kidding," Callum mumbled, wiping grease off his hands onto pants that hadn't been cleaned since ever. It was a ritualistic exchange, this banter about their overlords, the Ithar, those self-appointed alien custodians of morality who took themselves way too seriously. "Anyway, gotta go," Rick said, cutting off with a pop that suggested he'd crushed the faulty comm in his excitement over avoiding another chat. Callum shook his head. Rick's had the subtlety of a malfunctioning android, but he was right about one thing: he needed to move. The Ithar were nothing if not predictable in their unpredictable patrols. He stuffed the arm into a sack, a decision he'd regret in about 5 minutes, and slunk through the alleys of Etherian, each a narrow strip of gloom and foul-smelling secrets. The city was a crumbling relic, the kind tourists gushed over in brochures before realizing it was a monument to disappointment and bad urban planning. The whole place was an architectural oxymoron, temples sitting on top of shanties, religious iconography adorning walls that were more patchwork than structure. It was like someone had tried to build a utopia with all the wrong instructions. "Callum," a frantic whisper stopped him in his tracks. It was Mira, a fellow human and sometimes accomplice in the fine art of surviving Etherian. Her eyes darted nervously like she expected the High Cleric himself to pop out of a trash can. "Relax, Mira," Callum said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "The Ithar are too busy counting their devotion credits to bother with us." "It's not the Ithar," she insisted, grabbing his arm and pulling him into a shadowed alcove. "It's worse." "Define worse," he said, wishing he could rewind to before Mira found him. "There's talk of a prophecy," Mira explained, eyes wide with something between fear and amusement. It was hard to tell in this dim light. "A human who stumbles into the forbidden zone will bring about the downfall of the Ithar," Callum laughed, a short, sharp bark that echoed down the alley. "And they say humans are egotistical." "No, really," Mira persisted. "Zargoth's got his robes in a twist over it. He's doubling patrols looking for agents of chaos." "Well, that's great news," Callum said dryly. "I always wanted to be a footnote in a religious meltdown." "Seriously, Callum," Mira said, urgency creeping into her tone. "They're hunting for someone with one arm." Callum frowned, realization dawning like a particularly unpleasant sunrise. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." She pointed at the sack. "And you've got the winning entry right there." For a pacifist, Callum had plenty of experience with panic. It was a necessary survival skill in Etherian, ranking just above sarcasm and just below knowing when to duck. He shoved the sack into her hands. "You deal with it. I've got a reputation to uphold, one that doesn't end with being strung up as a heretic." Mira hesitated, then nodded, taking the sack like it was a bomb. "You owe me for this. Big time." "Put it on my tab," Callum quipped, already moving away. If Etherian had a heart, it was a black, shriveled thing prone to skipping beats. Callum wove through the twisting streets, every turn a calculated gamble. The air hummed with tension, and the usual chatter of the city had quieted, a bad omen if ever there was one. As he slipped through the crowd, humans, aliens, and a few things that defied classification, he kept one ear tuned to the buzz of conversation. The Ithar's prophecy was on everyone's lips, a delicious morsel of gossip served with a side of dread. And then a voice boomed over the loudspeakers, cutting through the noise like a rusty blade. "Attention, citizens of Etherian," it declared, with all the gravitas of a funeral march. "High Cleric Zargoth demands your cooperation in these troubled times. Anyone with information regarding the prophecy is urged to report to the nearest Ithar official." Callum gritted his teeth, a futile gesture that did nothing for his growing unease. The Ithar had a talent for taking a bad situation and making it worse, usually with a sanctimonious lecture and a side of unjust imprisonment. He ducked into a side street, hoping to avoid the increasingly on-edge patrols. The Ithar weren't known for their sense of humor, and he doubted they'd appreciate his particular brand of sarcasm. He was nearly at his hideout, a generous term for the cramped room that passed for home these days, when he heard footsteps behind him. It was instinct more than anything that made him spin around, heart thudding in his chest. Going somewhere human. The Ithar guard was tall even by their standards, with the kind of smile that suggested he practiced it in the mirror, a lot. Callum plastered on a grin that felt as false as it looked. "Just out for a stroll, officer. You know how it is, gotta keep the blood flowing." The guard's eyes narrowed, a humorless gleam in them. "You're not planning on fulfilling any prophecies today, are you?" "Prophecies, me? Nah, I'm allergic to destiny," Callum replied, trying to inch away without being obvious about it. The guard stepped closer, effectively cutting off any escape. "We wouldn't want you causing any trouble now, would we?" "Trouble? I'm the least troublesome guy in this city." Callum's voice dripped with the kind of sincerity only a terminal liar could muster. "Let's keep it that way." The guard's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "You humans are always finding new ways to disappoint." With a final, lingering look, the guard turned and sauntered away, apparently satisfied with his attempt at intimidation. Callum let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, sagging against the wall. His heart was still doing its best impression of a war drum, but at least he was still breathing, and not in a cell. He pushed off the wall, deciding that maybe today was a good day to lay low. The Ithar might have been humorless zealots, but they had a knack for sniffing out trouble, and Callum had a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Back in his hideout, Callum slumped into a chair, the kind that was more rust than metal. Shutting his eyes, he tried not to think about the prophecy, or the Ithar, or the fact that one wrong step could land him in a rather uncomfortable interrogation session. But thoughts had a habit of ignoring orders, and his mind circled back to the prophecy like a vulture on a carcass. What if there was some truth to it? Not that he believed in destiny. He barely believed in breakfast most days. And yet the Ithar were rattled, and that was worth something. If nothing else, it meant they weren't untouchable. Of course, that was small comfort to a guy who couldn't even touch his toes without pulling something. With a heavy sigh, Callum got to his feet, deciding that maybe, just maybe, he should pay Mira a visit. If he was going to be the unwitting star of this cosmic comedy, he might as well have a sidekick, or at least someone to blame when it all went to hell. Callum leaned back on the rusting, creaking excuse of a chair, contemplating his situation with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for a tax audit. Etherian was a garbage heap, but it was his garbage heap, and he was damned if some prophecy-crazed aliens were going to chase him out of it. The room was small, cramped enough that if you breathed too deeply, you risked sucking paint chips off the wall. The kind of place where the idea of personal space was more of a cruel joke than a reality. He'd lived here a long time, long enough that the peeling wallpaper had become his own Rorschach test for insanity. His comm device buzzed to life, the noise akin to a dying mosquito in a windstorm. Rix's voice crackled through. "Callum, you still alive?" Against all odds, Callum replied, trying not to sound too relieved. How's the end of the world looking on your side? About what you'd expect. Lots of people running around looking important and terrified. Speaking of which, you might want to keep your head down. High Cleric Zargoth's doubled patrols. Callum released a breath that tasted like rusty metal and regrets. Yeah, I noticed, but thanks for the warning. I'll just add it to the growing list of reasons to avoid public spaces. You're a real marvel of human optimism, you know that? Rick snorted. And you're a shining example of punctuality, Callum shot back. Still waiting on those 10 credits. Rick chuckled, the sound distorted by static. Hey, if the Ithar don't string you up first, I'll have your credits. Promise? Callum ended the call with the press of a button that barely functioned, just like everything else in his life. Still, Rick's words replayed in his head, keep your head down, as if that was an option. Callum had a better chance of growing a third arm than staying out of trouble, and speaking of arms, he needed Mira. Mira had the sack, and that sack was about as welcome in Etherian as a blaster shot to the face. He decided to risk the journey, knowing full well that getting from his hideout to Mira's wasn't unlike a high-stakes game of dodgeball with invisible balls and exceptionally paranoid referees. On the way, he stuck to the back alleys, the ones that smelled like despair and unwashed feet. The city was quieter than usual, the tension thick enough to slice with a dull spoon. Even the usual street vendors, those brave souls hawking questionable goods, seemed to have vanished, probably muttering something about prophecies and human scapegoats. Callum found Mira in her usual spot, a dingy corner of a dingy building that passed for the local watering hole. She was sitting on a crate, fiddling with the sack like it might explode, which, considering its contents, wasn't entirely out of the question. Mira, he called, trying not to sound like a man on the brink of panic. You still have it. Her eyes met his, and she lifted the sack with a resigned sigh. You mean this lovely piece of future litigation? Yeah, I have it. But we need to talk about your tendency to bring me problems that can get us both killed. Hey, you volunteered, he replied, trying for levity and missing by a mile. Anyway, any chance we can turn this into something less prophetic? Mira gave him a look that suggested she'd been practicing it specifically for idiots like him. You mean, like finding another arm and pretending they are a matching set? Sure, let me just pop down to the arm store. That'd be great, thanks, Callum said, grinning despite himself. But seriously, we need a plan. I thought pacifists didn't do plans, she teased, her smile a rare and welcome sight. Isn't that the point? Usually, yeah. Right now, I'm thinking about making an exception. Mira leaned back, crossing her arms. Okay, genius, what's the plan? Callum opened his mouth, the words, I have no bloody idea, almost making it out when a collective gasp from outside interrupted. They both turned towards the entrance as a group of Ithar priests marched through the street, chanting something that sounded suspiciously like holy retribution. Callum's stomach sank faster than a stone in a black hole. I think the plan starts with getting out of here. They didn't have to wait long for the Ithar to make the next move. The door burst open, revealing not one but two priests, their expressions a mix of annoyance and an eagerness that made Callum instinctively recoil. You there, one barked, pointing a finger that seemed accusatory by design. You are Callum, are you not? Callum considered lying, but that was pointless. Depends who's asking. The High Cleric Zargoth demands your presence, the other priest announced, his voice as smooth as a gravel road. You have been identified as the human of interest. Interest. That was one way to put it. Mira shifted beside him, her hand resting on the sack. What if we refuse? The priests exchanged glances, their surprise evident, as if anyone refused a summons from the Ithar. Refusal is not an option, the first priest declared, his mouth twitching in what might have been an attempt at a smile. You will accompany us. Callum glanced at Mira, then back to the priests. Well, when you put it like that, how can I refuse? They were ushered out into the street, a surreal parade of doom with the Ithar priests as overly enthusiastic tour guides. The crowd parted around them, whispers following in their wake as people caught sight of Callum, the human of interest, the prophecy incarnate, or just some poor sap with terrible luck. Etherian's temples loomed closer, their spires piercing the sky like accusatory fingers. Callum had never been inside, had never wanted to. The Ithar made a habit of keeping humans out of their sacred spaces, and most humans were happy to return the favor. Yet here he was, crossing the threshold under the watchful gaze of the High Cleric himself, Zargoth, a creature who looked as though he'd been carved from granite and given an unyielding sense of purpose. "Ah, Callum," Zargoth greeted, his voice resonant as a cathedral bell. "You are the one who has stirred the winds of destiny." Callum swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. "I think you have the wrong guy. I'm more of a light breeze kind of person." Zargoth's expression didn't change, though something like amusement flickered in his eyes. Humility, unexpected in one destined to challenge the order. "Destined is a strong word," Callum said, forcing a smile that felt like it might shatter his face. "I prefer unintentionally involved." A murmur rippled through the assembly, the Ithar priests exchanging confused looks, their rigid sense of order fraying at the edges. Zargoth raised a hand, silencing them with the ease of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You carry with you an artifact of significance," Zargoth continued, gesturing toward the sack Mira clutched like a lifeline. "It marks you as a figure of change." Callum exchanged a glance with Mira, the kind that conveyed 1,000 silent curses and pleas for salvation. This was it, the moment where destiny or sheer dumb luck would decide their fate. "Change can be good," Callum offered, his voice a touch too high. "Take this conversation, for example. It's very enlightening." Zargoth's eyes narrowed, not missing the sarcasm. "The Ithar do not fear change, Callum. We fear chaos. And you, it seems, are an agent of the latter. Agent me. I'm just a guy who stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time," Callum argued, trying to sound convincing and failing spectacularly. "Perhaps. Yet the prophecy cannot be ignored." The crowd leaned in, hungry for revelations that might alleviate the monotony of their lives. Callum felt like a bug under a magnifying glass, the heat of scrutiny intensifying with every second. "Show us the artifact," Zargoth commanded, a challenge wrapped in an invitation. Mira hesitated, then stepped forward, opening the sack with deliberate care. The mechanical arm inside glinted dully, catching the light in a way that seemed almost theatrical. There was a collective intake of breath, as though the crowd had expected something far more divine. Zargoth regarded the arm with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "Is this your idea of a miracle, human?" "Miracle's a strong word," Callum said, fighting the urge to roll his eyes. "More like a handy piece of engineering." The High Cleric raised an eyebrow, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Perhaps we have underestimated the ingenuity of your kind." Callum didn't know whether to take that as a compliment or a death sentence. "Ingenious, maybe. Harmless, definitely. I promise it won't bite." Zargoth's gaze lingered on the arm, then shifted back to Callum. "And yet, it has captured the attention of our people." The tension in the room ratcheted up a notch, the assembled Ithar murmuring amongst themselves. Callum wished for the comforting anonymity of Etherian streets, the bustle that allowed him to disappear. But here, in the heart of Ithar power, he was as visible as a flare in the night. "You will remain here as our guest," Zargoth declared, the finality in his tone quelling any possible protest, "until we determine the truth of this prophecy." "Guest," Mira echoed, disbelief coloring her voice. "That's a nice way to say prisoner." "Guests are treated with honor," Zargoth replied, his expression unreadable. "Prisoners are not." "How reassuring," Callum muttered, the sarcasm thick enough to chew on. "I'm sure the accommodations will be lovely." The High Cleric inclined his head, a gesture that might have been mistaken for respect. "Rest assured, we will not harm you." The Ithar priests closed ranks, their presence a silent yet insistent escort. Callum and Mira exchanged one last look, a shared understanding passing between them. This wasn't the end, just another twist in a spiral that seemed determined to pull them deeper into the Ithar's enigmatic world. Callum could only hope that this prophecy, whatever it truly was, had a sense of humor as twisted as his own, because if it didn't, they were in for one hell of a ride. Callum and Mira settled into the Ithar's version of a guest room, a windowless, cold chamber with a single uncomfortable-looking bench. It was like they'd taken hospitality tips from a prison architect. Callum wasn't surprised, of course. The Ithar weren't known for their warm welcomes or five-star accommodations. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Mira said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she dropped onto the bench. "I always dreamed of being a guest in a space cult's brick-and-mortar model of hell. Free room and board, though," Callum replied, trying to muster some optimism. It came out more like a cough. "True, but the staff's bloody miserable." Mira kicked at the metal floor with the tip of her boot. "Got any plans for dinner? Or are we fasting in honor of the almighty scrap heap? Dinner might be more of a when the universe ends kind of deal," Callum replied, glancing around for any signs of surveillance. "I'd say we're on their terms now." Mira pulled the sack closer, the mechanical arm still nestled inside. "Well, they certainly seem to think you're special, like the kind of special that needs a padded room. Flattering, isn't it?" Callum leaned against the wall, trying to ignore the chill seeping through his shirt. "It's not every day you're mistaken for a messiah by a bunch of starry-eyed aliens," Mira snorted. "Starry-eyed, maybe, but I doubt their eyes have seen stars in a while. Have you noticed how twitchy they are? Like they expect you to start levitating any second." "Let's hope they don't hold their breath," Callum said, suppressing a grin. "I can barely get my socks on in the morning, let alone raise the dead or whatever they think I'm here for." The door slid open, interrupting their banter. A Ithar priest stepped in, his expression the sort of grim that suggested constipation rather than divine revelation. "You are summoned," he announced, voice cold enough to strip paint. "Summoned? That sounds serious," Callum said, not bothering to hide his reluctance. "Can it wait until after tea?" The priest blinked, clearly not programmed for humor. "High Cleric Zargoth requires your presence now." Callum exchanged a glance with Mira, who shrugged. "Guess the boss man awaits," she said, standing up and shouldering the sack. "I hope they have snacks." "I'm starving." They were led through a series of corridors that seemed designed to disorient. The walls, a dull metal gray, were punctuated only by the occasional flickering light. Callum half expected a minotaur to leap out at them from the next corner. Finally, they emerged into what could generously be called a hall. Zargoth stood at the center, surrounded by a coterie of priests whose expressions ranged from mildly interested to about to nod off. Callum stopped a few paces away, resisting the urge to bow or salute or whatever the hell was appropriate in this situation. "Welcome, Callum," Zargoth intoned, as if they hadn't just seen each other. "We have much to discuss." "Great," Callum said. "I've been meaning to talk about your organization's lack of a marketing strategy." A few priests exchanged puzzled glances, but Zargoth didn't miss a beat. "You mock, yet your presence has sparked a movement within our ranks." "Movement?" Callum echoed, genuinely baffled. "I barely sparked my morning coffee." Zargoth gestured towards a group of Ithar at the back, their robes less pristine and their eyes alight with something dangerously close to hope. "There are those among us who believe you herald a new era." Callum felt a headache brewing, the kind that would require industrial-strength aspirin. "Okay, can we clarify what kind of new era we're talking about here?" "Because my resume's pretty light on revolution." Mira shifted beside him, looking into the crowd. "What happens if they find out he's just a guy with a knack for bad timing?" Zargoth's expression turned solemn. "The belief itself is a force, one we cannot easily control. Already, dissent grows among those who see you as a sign of change." Callum pinched the bridge of his nose. "Dissent? Wonderful. I always wanted to be the center of a brewing civil dispute. The High Cleric seeks to maintain balance." Another priest interjected, his voice tinged with urgency. "But there are whispers of your name spreading from the sacred pits to the very heart of our society." "Whispers, huh?" Callum said, crossing his arms. "I always said I'd make it big in alien gossip circles." Zargoth ignored the jibe. You must understand, Callum, your actions now are pivotal. You cannot take this lightly, right? Because I'm so known for my seriousness, Callum replied, deadpan. The crowd stirred, a mix of admiration and skepticism in the air. Callum felt the weight of their collective gaze, a burden he'd never asked for and didn't particularly want. Look, I'm just a guy who got dragged into this mess, he said, addressing the crowd. I'm not a hero or a prophet or whatever label you're slapping on me, Mira nudged him. Callum, maybe dial it back a notch. They might actually listen to you, wouldn't that be a first? He muttered, glancing at her. Fine, let's try this another way, he turned back to Zargoth. What do you want from me? A miracle. A way to keep your people from tearing each other apart. Both, if possible, Zargoth replied, not missing a beat. The artifact you possess, it has become a symbol. We must determine its true nature. Callum sighed, the weight of the situation finally settling on him like a lead blanket. You know, this was not on my to-do list for the week. Nevertheless, it is your responsibility now, Zargoth said, his gaze unwavering. Will you help us find the truth? Callum looked at Mira, who gave him a small nod. Guess I don't have much of a choice, do I? He said, turning back to the High Cleric. Very well, Zargoth said. You will be given access to our records and any resources you require. Callum nodded, relief tempered with a healthy dose of skepticism. All right. Let's see where this rabbit hole leads. As they were led away, the whispers in the hall followed them like a shadow, an undercurrent of tension that promised things were far from over. Callum had a feeling they were just getting started. Later, after what felt like an eternity of historical scrolls and holographic projections that would bore even the most dedicated archivist to tears, Callum found himself back in their cozy little cell of contemplation. Mira was pacing, her impatience palpable. Well, that was enlightening, she said, folding her arms. Did you learn anything useful, or was it all ancient bedtime stories? Callum rubbed his temples. Mostly bedtime stories. But there's something about an ancient rebellion against tyranny that might be relevant. Seems they've got a long history of not getting along with their own kind. Mira raised an eyebrow. And here I thought they were just a bunch of scrap-loving pacifists. Turns out even scrap-lovers have their breaking point, Callum said, leaning back against the wall. Seems some of them see me as a chance to shake things up. Lucky you, Mira replied dryly. A human catalyst for alien civil unrest. Just what the galaxy ordered. Yeah, I'm practically a walking universal disaster, Callum said with a wry grin. But if they think I'm going to lead them to some promised land, they're sorely mistaken. Then what's the plan? Mira asked, her tone softening. You're not seriously considering going along with this, are you? Callum shrugged. Honestly, I'm considering whatever keeps us alive and gets us out of here. And if that means playing along with their delusions of grandeur, Mira asked. Then I'll play the part until I find a way to rewrite the script, Callum replied, determination edging into his voice. Their conversation was cut short by another knock at the door. A different priest stood there, looking somewhat less constipated than the last one, but only just. The High Cleric requests your presence, the priest said, eyes darting between them like he expected one of them to bolt. Again, what's it now? Another chapter of prophecy for dummies, Mira quipped. Callum rose with a resigned sigh. Let's go see what the great Zargoth has up his sleeve this time. Mira followed, the sack with the so-called artifact slung over her shoulder. As they walked, Callum couldn't help but wonder if the Ithar really believed in all this prophecy nonsense, or if it was just a convenient excuse to shake things up among their ranks. In the hall, Zargoth awaited them, flanked by the usual entourage of priests. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in the air, an unspoken challenge that simmered just beneath the surface. Callum, Zargoth began, his voice carrying an edge of urgency. We have received word from our scouts. There is unrest brewing beyond our borders. Unrest. What a shocker, Callum said, crossing his arms. Seems like that's all anyone's brewing these days. Zargoth didn't rise to the bait. The dissenters among us grow bolder. They see you as a harbinger of change and seek to use your presence to rally others to their cause. Callum exchanged a look with Mira. And you think I can stop it? What am I supposed to do, give a motivational speech? The path is unclear, Zargoth admitted, a rare crack in his otherwise stoic demeanor. But your involvement is undeniable. We must find a way to channel this energy constructively, or risk it blowing up in your face, Mira added, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Zargoth nodded. Precisely. We cannot allow chaos to unravel the fabric of our society. Callum sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. All right, I get it. I'll do what I can. But you better have a plan B, because I'm not exactly a miracle worker. Zargoth inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt almost respectful. We will support you in whatever way we can. For now, keep your eyes open and your mind ready. That's all I've been doing since I got here, Callum replied, a hint of weariness in his voice. But I'll try to come up with something. As they were dismissed, Callum couldn't shake the feeling that he was teetering on the edge of something big, a wave of change that threatened to swallow them all if he didn't find a way to navigate it. Navigating it, however, was going to require all the cunning, luck, and sheer stubbornness he could muster. And maybe, just maybe, figuring out what to do with a mechanical arm that seemed to have more significance than he'd ever imagined. One thing was certain. The days of quietly blending into the background of Etherian were well and truly over. Callum sat on the hard, cold bench in the Ithar's guest room, which was as welcoming as a hug from a cactus. It was the kind of place that made you realize how much you appreciated the concept of comfort. Mira leaned against the wall, idly tossing the mechanical arm in the air like a juggler with a death wish. The calm device buzzed to life, sounding like it was on its last legs. Callum glanced at it with a mix of curiosity and dread. And here I thought my days of being a galactic helpline were behind me. Mira snorted. Yeah, you're just one call away from solving everyone's problems. The miracle worker who can't even work his own miracles. Callum tapped the device, and Rix's voice crackled through, half drowned in static. Callum, you there? Unfortunately, Callum replied, rubbing his temples. What's the latest? The Ithar dissenters want a word. They're seeing you as a beacon of hope. The messiah they've been waiting for, apparently, Callum grimaced. I always wanted to lead a cult. Somehow I thought there'd be more palm leaves and less existential dread. Don't flatter yourself, Rix said dryly. They just need someone to blame when it all goes south. Great, I've always wanted to be the fall guy in an interstellar civil war, Callum muttered. Mira shrugged. Look on the bright side. At least you'll be famous. Infamous maybe, but still, Rix's voice continued. They're holding clandestine meetings, they want you there. Something about discussing pacifism or some such nonsense. Pacifism and clandestine meetings. Those go together like oil and water, Callum said. Or like you and heroism, Mira added with a smirk. Callum sighed. Fine, tell them I'll be there. Got nothing better to do than be a bad influence. The comm device cut off, leaving behind a silence louder than any noise. Callum looked at Mira. I've got a bad feeling about this. You always have a bad feeling, she replied. It's practically your superpower. Callum chuckled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He knew this was a tightrope walk over a pit filled with spikes, and each step felt more precarious than the last. The clandestine meeting was set in one of the less sacred corners of the Ithar holy pits, which basically meant it was less of a rubbish heap than the others. The dissenters had gathered, huddled together like conspirators in a cheap spy novel. Callum felt like he was walking into a badly organized book club. Welcome, Callum, one of the dissenters said, his voice low and reverent, as if he was speaking to a living legend rather than a mildly terrified human. Let's cut to the chase, Callum said. You guys are planning something, and you think I'm the guy to help you do it. The group murmured in agreement, a few nodding like bobbleheads. Your ideals of pacifism intrigue us, the lead dissenter said. We believe they could guide us in our struggle. Callum pinched the bridge of his nose. Just to clarify, pacifism means not fighting, the opposite of what you're planning. Yes, but your presence challenges us. It makes us think, another dissenter piped up. I'm glad my existential crisis is so inspiring, Callum said. But if you're looking to me for a battle plan, you're barking up the wrong tree. Not a battle plan, the lead dissenter said. A way to change minds, to shift perspectives without bloodshed. Callum paused, considering. Changing minds is trickier than changing the universe. People are stubborn creatures. The dissenters exchanged glances, clearly unaccustomed to the idea of winning a war without weapons. In the silence, Callum could almost hear the gears grinding in their heads. It was the kind of noise that made you want to check for a malfunction. Look, I'm not saying it's impossible, Callum continued, but it's going to take a lot of patience, and probably a lot more than just my charming presence. Mira rolled her eyes. Charming, right. Maybe we should start by defining what you mean by charming. Hey, I got dragged into this mess for a reason, Callum shot back. And I'm hoping it's not just to be the universe's punching bag. You have sparked something in us, the dissenter insisted. Perhaps that is enough to begin, Callum shrugged. Maybe, but remember I'm just a guy, an unwilling guy at that. Let's not get carried away with the whole Messiah thing. The group nodded, albeit reluctantly, like a bunch of kids told Christmas had been postponed. Keep it simple, Callum advised. Talk to your people, listen to their grievances, see if there's a way to address them without resorting to violence. Dialogue, the lead dissenter said, as if tasting the word for the first time. Callum nodded. Yeah, dialogue. It's a crazy concept, I know. With that, the meeting drifted to an end, leaving Callum feeling like he'd just stepped off a stage after a particularly challenging performance. Mira fell in a step beside him as they left the holy pit. You think they'll actually listen? She asked. Callum shrugged. Maybe, maybe not, but if there's a chance to avoid a bloodbath, it's worth a shot. Still, Mira said, it's a tall order. Ithar aren't exactly known for their love of peaceful resolutions. Yeah, well, I wasn't exactly planning on being their motivational speaker either, Callum replied. As they walked back to their cell, or whatever passed for a home in this alien hellscape, the increased military presence became impossible to ignore. Patrols were everywhere, their steps heavy with authority and intimidation. Looks like Zargoth's doubling down, Mira observed, her eyes scanning the troopers with a mix of skepticism and disdain. Guess he's not taking chances, Callum replied. Can't say I blame him. They reached the cell to find Zargoth waiting, his expression as grim as ever. Callum, he began without preamble, there's been an increase in dissenting activities. Callum raised an eyebrow. No kidding. Maybe they're just throwing a surprise party. Zargoth didn't seem amused. The dissenters are growing bolder, your presence is emboldening them. Yeah, I've got a knack for that, Callum drawled. What's the plan? Crackdown, mass arrests, public floggings. Zargoth's eyes darkened. We seek a peaceful resolution, but the situation is escalating. Tell me something I don't know, Callum replied. Look, I've been talking to them. Trying to get them to see reason. Zargoth studied him, his gaze piercing. And do they listen? Callum shrugged. Some of them maybe, but it's slow going, like trying to teach a slug to tap dance. Mira snorted. Sounds about right. Zargoth nodded, though whether in understanding or resignation was unclear. Continue your efforts. We wish to avoid conflict if possible. Callum gave a mock salute. Aye, aye, Captain. I'll keep playing the reluctant diplomat. As Zargoth left, Callum flopped onto the bench, exhausted despite the lack of physical exertion. This whole Messiah gig is really cutting into my nap time, Mira chuckled. You always said you wanted to make a difference. Looks like you're getting your wish. Yeah, but I was hoping for something with a bit less risk of martyrdom, Callum replied. Their comms device buzzed again and Rix's voice came through. Heard there's a lot of movement on the military front. You guys holding up? Just peachy, Rix, Callum said. We've got a whole army camping outside our humble abode. It's like being in a bad neighborhood with none of the perks. Keep your head down, Callum, Rix advised. This is getting out of hand. Don't worry, Callum replied. I've got a plan. What plan? Mira asked, raising an eyebrow. Callum shrugged. The plan where we don't die, obviously. Mira shook her head, but there was a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "You're a real inspiration, Callum." "That's what they tell me," he said with a wry grin. Despite the bravado, Callum knew they were walking a razor's edge. One misstep, one wrong word, and the fragile peace they were trying to maintain could shatter, leaving them amidst the debris of a war they never wanted to be part of. "So, what now?" Mira asked. "We keep talking," Callum replied. "Keep trying to get through to them, and hope like hell the Ithar decide dialogue's a better option than blowing each other to bits." Mira nodded. "And if they don't," Callum sighed, "then we improvise. I've always been good at that." With that uncomfortably vague plan in mind, they settled into their makeshift home, knowing that tomorrow would bring more questions than answers, more challenges than solutions. But for the moment they were alive, and sometimes, in a universe as unpredictable as this one, that was all that mattered. Callum couldn't help but feel like he was the only non-drunk in a bar full of belligerent drinkers, chaos brewing all around him, and he was the designated driver tasked with getting everyone home safely. Except the home in question was a ticking time bomb, and the everyone was a bunch of angry Ithar dissenters, and a regime that viewed diplomacy as a quaint, outdated hobby. "High Cleric Zargoth's gone and labeled you the head honcho of the rebellion," Rix announced through the comm device with the kind of enthusiasm you'd reserve for reading a phone book. Callum rolled his eyes. "Great. I've always wanted to be the poster child for an uprising I didn't start." Mira snorted, giving the mechanical arm in her sack a gentle pat, as if it were a pet. "Think of it this way. When they write the history books, you'll be the misunderstood martyr. They'll probably get someone handsome to play you in the holodocs." "Yeah, because that's what matters right now," Callum said, rubbing his temples. "All I wanted was to convince a bunch of aliens not to go full-blown war on each other. Instead, I've got a target painted on my back the size of a small moon." "How big's a small moon?" Mira asked absently. Callum shrugged. "Big enough that you don't want to be standing in its shadow. The Ithar holy pits, usually a hubbub of whispered meetings and furtive glances, now seemed like a deserted graveyard. The dissenters who had once huddled together with delusions of peaceful revolution were conspicuously absent, probably hiding under their sacred scrap heaps," Callum mused. "Where is everyone?" Mira asked, her voice echoing in the eerie quiet that hung over the pits like the smell of burnt toast. Callum scanned the area, feeling the weight of the emptiness press down on him. "Either they finally got tired of my motivational speeches, or Zargoth's goons paid them a visit." "Place your bets on option number 2, Mira said, her tone as dry as a desert. Callum sighed. "Looks like the crackdown's in full swing. I was hoping we'd have a bit more time to not solve anything." "Well, they say time flies when you're trying to avert an interstellar civil war," Mira quipped. "Yeah, and it's flying first class," Callum muttered. They trudged through the pits, the silence a constant reminder of how quickly things could spiral from bad to worse. It was the kind of silence that felt like a predator, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. "You really think Zargoth's going to buy this peaceful resolution crap?" Mira asked, breaking the oppressive quiet. Callum shook his head. "I doubt it. Peaceful resolutions aren't exactly his style, more of a crush and conquer kind of guy. If he were a serial, he'd be Genocide OS. Now with more oppression," Mira said. Callum couldn't help but chuckle. "That's horrible. I love it." Their somber banter was interrupted by a sudden rush of footsteps and the unmistakable sound of armored boots hitting the ground with the precision of a well-oiled machine. It was the kind of sound that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up and start looking for the nearest exit. "Looks like we've got company," Mira said, her hand already inching toward the sack with the mechanical arm. Callum held up a hand. "Let's try talking first. If that fails, you can whip out your secret weapon." "Secret weapon," Mira scoffed. "It's a glorified can opener, Callum." "Hey, in the right hands, a can opener can be a deadly weapon," Callum replied, just as the Ithar troopers rounded the corner, weapons drawn, looking about as friendly as a pack of rabid wolves. "Callum," one of the troopers barked. his voice echoing in the hollow pit. "Under the authority of High Cleric Zargoth, you're to be detained for inciting rebellion." Callum raised his hands, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm just a guy who doesn't want to see things blow up." "Orders are orders," the trooper said, clearly not in the mood for negotiations. Mira glanced at Callum, her expression a mix of defiance and something close to admiration. "Well, looks like your plan to not die is off to a great start." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Callum said as the troopers closed in, their grips on their weapons as tight as their expressions. As the troopers escorted them to what Callum could only assume was a cell as welcoming as a bear trap, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a whole lot worse before they got better. Assuming they got better at all. Once inside the cold, unwelcoming walls of the Ithar's guest room, a place that made a prison cell seem like a luxury suite, Callum was left alone to stew in his thoughts. It was precisely the kind of room that made you reconsider all your life choices, especially the ones that led you to be imprisoned by aliens who thought dialogue was some sort of exotic dish. "High Cleric Zargoth will see you now," a guard announced, his voice devoid of anything resembling empathy or humor. Maybe those were optional in Ithar boot camp. Callum was unceremoniously dragged before Zargoth, whose expression was a mix of disdain and impatience, as if he were a teacher, and Callum the particularly dense student who just couldn't grasp algebra. "Callum," Zargoth began, his voice as cold as the room they stood in, "your interference has become intolerable." "Interference?" Callum asked, feigning innocence. "I prefer to think of it as constructive feedback." Zargoth's eyes narrowed. "You have emboldened the dissenters. They see you as a symbol." "Symbol? More like a scapegoat," Callum retorted. "I'm just trying to keep everyone from killing each other." Zargoth leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Your methods are ineffective. The dissenters grow bolder and the peace you preach remains elusive." Callum sighed. "It's hard to teach a fish to fly, Zargoth. Change takes time." Zargoth sat back, unimpressed. "Time we do not have. Measures must be taken." "Measures?" "Let me guess. The kind that involve a lot of shouting and even more shooting?" Callum asked, knowing full well the answer. Zargoth gave a thin smile, the kind that made you wish you were anywhere else. "Order must be restored. Peace through strength." "Sounds like a catchy slogan for a despotic regime," Callum quipped, earning him a glare that could have melted steel. "They say sarcasm is the lowest form of wit," Zargoth said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Then I must be in the basement," Callum replied, refusing to back down. "You will remain here until this matter is resolved," Zargoth declared, turning away as if the conversation had ended. Callum watched him go, feeling like he'd just been dismissed by the universe's most humorless principle. Left alone, he considered his options, none of which seemed particularly appealing. At best, he could try to reason his way out of this. At worst, well, he'd seen enough movies to know how dire that could get. The door creaked open once more and Mira slipped in, a shadow among shadows. "I'm guessing the talk with Zargoth didn't go too well," Callum shrugged. "Let's just say he's not putting me on his holiday card list." "Well, I've got good news and bad news," Mira said, her voice a lifeline in the gloom. "Hit me with the bad news first," Callum replied, bracing himself. "The dissenters have gone underground, literally. Zargoth's crackdown has them running scared and there's no telling what they'll do in desperation." "Perfect," Callum said with a sigh. "And the good news," Mira grinned, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "I may have found a way to get us out of here." "Really?" Callum asked, his interest piqued. Mira nodded, her grin widening. "Turns out that glorified can-opener of mine has a few tricks up its sleeve." Callum raised an eyebrow. "Color me intrigued. What's the plan?" Mira held up the mechanical arm, the metal glinting in the dim light. "We improvise. It's kind of our specialty." Callum chuckled, feeling a sliver of hope where there had been none. "You're a genius, you know that." "Yeah, tell me something I don't know," Mira replied, her confidence contagious. As they began to hash out the details of their escape, Callum couldn't help but feel a sense of camaraderie with Mira. In a universe that seemed determined to crush them, it was nice to have someone who could make him laugh, even if the laughter was a bit forced and the humor dark as the void outside. "So, what's the worst that could happen?" Callum asked, half joking, half serious. Mira shrugged. "We could die horribly, but at least we'd do it trying to make a difference." Callum nodded, a resolute determination settling in his gut. "Then let's make sure we go out with a bang." With their plan, if it could be called that, set in motion, they knew the coming Iors would be crucial. It was a long shot, a gamble in the highest stakes game they'd ever played, but it was a chance to defy the odds, to prove that even in the bleakest situations, a glimmer of hope could still shine through. Callum rubbed his temples as he paced the confines of their cold, unwelcoming cell. The idea of escape bounced around his mind like a drunk mosquito, annoying but persistent. He glanced at Mira, who was busy tinkering with her mechanical arm. It jutted out from her bag like a bit of metallic blasphemy against the Ithar's beloved ironscape. "Any chance your opener can tune into the local cable?" Callum asked, half serious. "Could use some inspiration." Mira looked up, eyebrow arched. "Considering our channels would be either Prison Break Chronicles or Military Parade Live, I think I'll pass." "Fair point," Callum conceded. "But maybe it can help us find something useful in this alien junkyard they call a Temple City." Mira paused, her fingers stilling on the arm. "You're thinking about that old human tech they've got stored away. Why not? Maybe there's something there that the Ithar haven't quite figured out yet. We humans are pretty good at hiding surprise presents in unwanted places." "Great. Like a galactic Easter egg hunt," Mira said, smirking. "Just with higher stakes and less chocolate." Callum chuckled, but the humor died quickly in the stale air. "If we can unearth something they've overlooked, we might just find a crack in their armor. Like ancient Wi-Fi passwords," Mira joked, though her eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Or more," Callum said, tapping his chin. "Maybe something that can disrupt their tech. They might be aliens, but they are still relying on metal and circuits to get by." Mira stood, dusting off her hands. "I love a good treasure hunt." "How do you propose we get out of this lovely little suite?" Callum grinned, feeling a shot of adrenaline. "Turns out, Zargoth's cell security isn't foolproof, especially when you have a mechanical arm capable of playing havoc with the locks." Mira's grin mirrored his. "Now we're talking. Let's see what this baby can do." They moved to the door, Mira fiddling with the arm like a magician with a trick up her sleeve. The locks hissed and whirred, the sound akin to a robot clearing its throat. There was a final, satisfying click and the door swung open. "Nice," Callum whispered, peering into the hallway. "Nobody home." "Luck's on our side," Mira said with a grin. "Now where's this treasure trove of ancient human knowledge?" Callum stepped into the corridor, motioning for Mira to follow. "Follow me." "I've got a hunch." They maneuvered through the labyrinthine corridors, passing rooms and alcoves that seemed to serve no purpose other than being unnecessarily intimidating. The Ithar loved their ominous architecture. "This place is like a maze designed by someone who really hates people," Mira noted as they crept along. "Or someone who just really loves corridors," Callum replied. "Wonder if they have a map." "Maps are nice." "Yeah, but they don't help much when you're lost in an alien ant farm," Callum snorted. "True, but at least in an ant farm you know you're stuck in a box." "Speaking of boxes," Mira said, pointing to a door that looked slightly different from the others, "this looks promising." Callum approached, pressing his ear to the cold metal. "Hear anything?" "Nothing," Mira replied, her voice barely more than a breath. Callum nodded. "Let's see if this arm of yours can work its magic again." Mira got to work, the mechanical arm buzzing softly as it interfaced with the door controls. It wasn't long before the door slid open, revealing a room filled with shelves lined with relics and artifacts, all under layers of dust and neglect. "Behold, the Ithar's own lost and found," Mira quipped, stepping inside. Callum's eyes widened at the sight. "Looks like Christmas came early. Or late, depending on your perspective," Mira said as she began to rifle through the shelves. Callum joined her, sifting through the clutter with the precision of a bargain hunter at a flea market. "There's got to be something here we can use." "Like this?" Mira asked, holding up a small, sleek device that looked suspiciously like a remote control. "What's that? The keys to their spaceship?" Callum joked, taking it from her. Mira shrugged. "Maybe. Or a fancy TV remote. Either way, it's human tech, which means it might just have a language they don't speak." Callum studied the device, his mind racing. "If we can figure out what this thing does, maybe we can cause a little chaos. Shake things up, make the dissenters see that the regime isn't as bulletproof as they think." "That's a pretty big if," Mira pointed out. "Yeah, well, I've always been an optimist," Callum replied, his voice heavy with irony. "Optimist or not, we need to figure out what this does before Zargoth realizes we're playing dress-up in his toy room." Callum nodded, cradling the device like a precious artifact. "Let's find somewhere quiet to work on this. Somewhere Zargoth's goons won't stumble over us." "Back to the pits," Mira suggested. "Seems as good a place as any," Callum agreed. "There's still a few nooks and crannies they haven't sniffed out yet." They slipped out of the room, the device secured, their mission clear. It was a long shot, but then again, long shots were their specialty. With the stakes impossibly high, they made their way back through the temple city, hoping they could outsmart an alien regime that had far more guns than patience. As they reached the pits, Mira cast a wary glance around. "You think the dissenters will be lurking nearby?" "With any luck," Callum replied. "They might just be desperate enough to listen to us this time." "Desperation's a great motivator," Mira said with a grin. "And if there's one thing we're overflowing with, it's desperation." Callum chuckled, feeling more confident than he had since this whole mess started. "Let's see if we can turn that into something useful." They settled into a corner of the pits, sheltered by the familiar heaps of junk and detritus. Callum studied the device, fingers tracing over its surface as Mira watched on. "Any ideas?" she asked. Callum frowned, looking for anything that seemed familiar. "Well, it's got buttons, that's a start." "Solid observation," Mira said dryly. "Hey, this is advanced button technology," Callum shot back. "Let's see what happens when I press one." Mira leaned away slightly just in case. "Let's hope it doesn't explode." Callum pressed a button, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the device lit up, humming softly, tiny lights flickering in sequence. "Hey, something's happening," Callum said, surprised but pleased. "Looks like it's booting up." Mira leaned closer, curiosity piqued. "What is it doing?" "No idea, but it's doing it quietly." "That's probably a good sign." As the device continued its silent operation, Callum noticed a small screen flickering to life with symbols he'd only seen in old Earth archives. "Looks like it's searching for something," he muttered. "Searching for what?" Mira asked. Callum shrugged. "Your guess is as good as mine. A signal, maybe." "Signal from where?" "I thought this junkyard was dead in the water." "Maybe it's picking up on more than we knew," Callum said, excitement creeping into his voice. Mira watched the device intently. "If this thing can give us a leg up on the Ithar tech, we might actually stand a chance." Callum nodded, a plan beginning to coalesce in his mind. "We're going to need to reach the dissenters. If we can show them that the Ithar tech isn't invincible, they might rally." "And how do you propose we do that without getting caught?" Mira asked. Callum smiled. "That, my dear Mira, is where your can opener comes in again." They spent the next few hours tinkering with the device, a process that involved a lot of guesswork and more than a little prayer to the gods of outdated technology. Finally, the device emitted a soft beep and the screen displayed a message in halting English. "Signal located. Transmission ready." "Wow," Mira breathed. "What's it transmitting?" Callum grinned, feeling a surge of triumph. "I have no idea, but if it can hijack their systems even for a moment, it might just be enough to show the dissenters they've got a fighting chance." "And if it doesn't?" Mira asked, her tone cautious. "Then we're back to square one with Zargoth breathing down our necks," Callum admitted. "But at least we're trying something." Mira nodded, determination in her eyes. "Then let's make sure it counts. We need to get this to the dissenters and show them what we've found." Callum stood, the device secure in his grip. "With any luck, they'll be on board and ready to make use of it." "Luck's been a bit of a mixed bag for us," Mira said, standing alongside him. "True," Callum conceded. But hope is a funny thing. Sometimes it just needs a little spark. And if they don't go for it, then we'll improvise, Callum said, echoing their earlier sentiment. It's not like we've got any other plans. As they prepared to leave the pits, Callum couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. In the midst of chaos and control, maybe there was still room for a little human ingenuity to tip the scales. "Ready?" Mira asked, her mechanical arm at the ready. Callum nodded. "Let's go light a fire under this rebellion." With their mind set, they ventured out, determined to ignite a spark of hope in the oppressive shadow of the Ithar regime. It was a gamble, but it was the only game they had left to play. And if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was betting against impossible odds, especially when they had a trick up their sleeve. Callum and Mira, in their ragtag glory, were making their way through the pits with the kind of swagger only people with nothing left to lose can muster. Their clothes were a mix of grime and determination, the perfect uniform for would-be saboteurs. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" Mira asked, adjusting her mechanical arm as they navigated the junkyard maze. Her voice was a blend of disbelief and excitement, the kind that comes with the realization you're about to do something profoundly stupid. "Looks like," Callum replied, squinting at the path ahead. "I've always wanted to be the guy who accidentally topples an alien regime. It's right up there with seeing Earth one last time." Mira snorted. "You and your bucket list." "What's next?" "Alien golf with the High Cleric's head. Only if we get out of here alive," Callum said with a wry smile. "But I hear it's a great cardio workout." Their banter was cut short as they reached a more secluded part of the pits. The dissenters were supposed to be meeting here, or so went the whispered rumors among the prisoners, rumors that were as reliable as a 2-credit watch. Callum spotted a few figures huddled in the shadows, their faces hidden by the dim light filtering through the overhead grating. The scent of desperation was palpable, like the air before a storm, thick with tension and the promise of chaos. "Evening," Callum said, trying his best to sound nonchalant. "Mind if we join you for a little light treason?" One of the figures, a gaunt Ithar with eyes like coal, turned to face them. "You bring gifts, human." "Something like that," Callum replied, holding up the device. "It's not a fruit basket, but it'll do." The Ithar looked unimpressed, which, to be fair, was their default expression. "And what do you intend to do with this trinket?" Mira stepped forward, her voice steady. "Show you that the regime's not as unbreakable as you think. You wanted hope, right? Well, here it is, wrapped up in a neat little package." Callum nodded. "It's a long shot, sure, but you folks seem like the type who enjoys a good gamble." The Ithar exchanged glances, their suspicion giving way to a cautious curiosity. "Show us," the gaunt one said, gesturing with a bony hand. Callum didn't need to be told twice. He placed the device on a flat surface, pressing the buttons with a mix of intuition and blind luck. The screen flickered to life, the soft hum filling the air like a distant echo of something important. "Now, we don't know exactly what this bad boy's transmitting," Callum admitted, "but it's pinging off something the Ithar hold dear. Could be the regime's comms system, could be their version of a nanny cam. Either way, it's gonna be a surprise." Mira leaned in, her mechanical arm resting on the ground like a guard dog. "And if it works, it'll show you that Zargoth's got chinks in his armor." The Ithar murmured among themselves, a ripple of excitement mingling with their skepticism. One of them, a stockier figure with a voice like gravel, finally spoke. "And what do you expect from us in return?" Callum shrugged. "Just a little support, a show of defiance. You know the usual." The gaunt Ithar tilted his head. "You expect us to rise up with this." "Toy, not rise up," Callum corrected. "Just step aside. Let Zargoth's power crumble under its own weight. We're just giving it a little nudge." "And if it fails?" the gravel-voiced Ithar asked. "Then we're all screwed," Mira said with a sardonic smile. "But at least we'll go down knowing we tried." The dissenters exchanged another series of glances, a silent conversation passing between them. After what felt like an eternity, the gaunt Ithar nodded. "We will prepare. But know this, human, if you betray us, there will be no corner of this universe where you will be safe. Callum grinned, a reckless glint in his eyes. Wouldn't have it any other way. With the dissenters cautiously on board, Callum and Mira set about making their preparations. It wasn't much, just a plan to get the device as close to the regime's central hub as possible. The Ithar's faith in their own tech would be their downfall, Callum hoped. "How are you holding up?" Mira asked as they finalized their route. "Well, considering we're about to crash an alien regime systems, I'm feeling pretty damn spectacular," Callum said, tucking the device securely in his jacket. "You've got a funny definition of spectacular," Mira replied. "But I guess when you're a perpetual optimist, everything looks like a silver lining." "Either that or I've lost my damn mind," Callum said with a chuckle. "But hey, who needs sanity when you've got luck on your side?" Mira nudged him with her mechanical arm, the gesture more reassuring than any words. "Ready to go mess with some aliens?" "Born ready," Callum replied. "Let's go give Zargoth something to really pray about." Moving stealthily through the temple city, they reached the heart of the Ithar's technological domain. The central hub was a fortress of cold metal and indifferent security, a testament to their overconfidence. Callum couldn't help but admire the sheer audacity of it all. "You know, I half expected this place to have more guards," he whispered. "Guess they figured nobody would be stupid enough to try this," Mira replied. "Well, they are in for a surprise," Callum said, smiling grimly as they approached the hub's entrance. The door was guarded by a pair of Ithar soldiers, their expressions as welcoming as a slap in the face. Callum shot Mira a look. Plan B, she agreed. Plan B was simple: cause a distraction and slip by while the guards were dealing with the chaos. Mira set to work with her mechanical arm, manipulating a nearby console with a skill that was as impressive as it was terrifying. A few moments later, alarms blared and lights flashed, Mira's handiwork having triggered a fire drill. The guards shuffled off, their stoic calm temporarily disrupted. "Nice work," Callum said as they slipped through the door. "Thank me later," Mira replied. "Right now, we've got a date with destiny." Inside the hub, the air was filled with the hum of machinery and the faint tang of ozone. Callum moved swiftly to the central terminal, the device clutched in his hand like a talisman. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, connecting the device to the terminal. The screen flickered and the soft hum grew louder. Mira stood watch, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of trouble. "How long do you think we've got?" "Long enough, I hope," Callum replied, watching the device do its thing. "Come on, you little miracle, work your magic." The device's lights flickered in a hypnotic dance, and for a moment Callum wondered if they'd overestimated its capabilities. But then the terminal screen changed, displaying a series of codes and sequences that he couldn't comprehend. "Is that good or bad?" Mira asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. "Good, I think," Callum said, his heart racing. "It's definitely doing something." As the device continued its work, the lights in the hub flickered, and the machinery hummed louder. Outside, the alarms continued to blare, a cacophony of chaos that seemed to echo their own defiance. And then it happened. A pulse of energy rippled out from the terminal, a wave of disruption that spread through the Ithar's network like wildfire. Callum could almost hear the collective gasp of the regime as their systems began to fail, one by one. "Did we just?" Mira started, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Yeah," Callum said, a grin splitting his face. "I think we did." The device had done its job. The regime's hold was slipping, the cracks in their power widening as the dissenters seized the moment. It was a non-violent uprising, a coup that relied on cunning and timing rather than brute force. Outside, the dissenters were rallying, their voices no longer whispers but shouts of defiance. Zargoth's regime, once unassailable, was crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. Callum and Mira stood in the hub, the realization of what they'd accomplished slowly sinking in. It was a victory, unexpected and improbable, but a victory nonetheless. "Looks like you were right, Callum," Mira said, a note of awe in her voice. "You really did light a fire." "Yeah," Callum replied, his expression one of satisfaction. "And now it's burning bright." With the regime's grip broken, the Ithar populace began to withdraw their support, leaving Zargoth isolated and powerless. The High Cleric's downfall was inevitable, a consequence of underestimating those he'd sought to control. As the chaos unfolded, Callum and Mira shared a rare moment of peace, the weight of their actions settling over them like a warm cloak. "You think we've changed anything?" Mira asked, her voice soft. "Maybe," Callum said, his gaze distant. "Or maybe we just gave them a chance to change things themselves." Mira nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I guess that's enough for now." Callum glanced at her, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "And who knows? Maybe one day we'll get to see Earth again." Mira chuckled, the sound light and genuine. "From your lips to the universe's ears, Callum." Together they watched as the Ithar embraced their newly won freedom, the darkness of oppression giving way to something brighter. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And sometimes a start was all you needed. As they prepared to leave the temple city behind, Callum felt a strange sense of fulfillment. They'd played their part, however small, in shaping the future. And for two humans in an alien world, that was no small feat. "Ready to see what comes next?" Mira asked, her mechanical arm resting on his shoulder. Callum grinned, his trademark optimism shining through. "Always." With that, they turned away from the hub, stepping into a future that was as uncertain as it was promising. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like anything was possible. And for Callum and Mira, that was more than enough. In the grand tradition of unintended consequences, Callum's little display of moral fortitude had snowballed into something he never imagined. Etherian was cleaning up its act, literally and politically. It was like watching a barroom brawl turn into a polite tea party, complete with finger sandwiches and passive-aggressive small talk. "Well, isn't that something?" Callum mused, standing on a rise overlooking the transformed landscape. The once garbage-strewn wasteland now showed budding patches of green, as the Ithar and humans had collectively decided that perhaps the place could use a bit more feng shui and a bit less eau de dump. Mira, ever the cynic with a heart of gold, or maybe just a heart of rust-proof metal, snorted beside him. "You accidentally start one little revolution and everyone's ready to plant daisies." "Not exactly what I had in mind," Callum admitted, scanning the horizon. "But I guess it's a step up from unwanted human intruder." The Ithar, once about as welcoming as a cactus sandwich, were now extending olive branches, literal ones, made from repurposed spare parts. High Cleric Zargoth had been dethroned, and judging by the rumors, was now trying his hand at pottery somewhere remote. Everyone needs a hobby, after all. It was indeed a bizarre twist of fate. The same Ithar who once regarded Callum as a glorified pest now hailed him as some sort of intergalactic Gandhi, the kind of guy who would lead them into a future of cooperation and coexistence. He wasn't sure if he should be flattered or deeply concerned for their judgment. "Think they'll be disappointed when they find out I'm just a guy who likes to tinker with old tech?" Callum asked, half joking. "Let's hope not," Mira replied, adjusting something on her mechanical arm. "Or they might decide to go back to the old regime, and then you'd be the most unpopular guy in the galaxy." He chuckled, though there was a note of truth in her words. The Ithar dissenters had taken his accidental heroism and run with it, far beyond anything he'd ever intended. They'd turned his technical hiccup into a manifesto, one that preached peace through mutual benefit, or at least mutual disdain for dirty metal piles. The temple city was buzzing with activity, Ithar and humans working side by side, dismantling old machinery to build new, sustainable tech. It was like watching ants rebuild their hill after a boot had flattened it, though this time it seemed they were intent on making it earthquake-proof. Callum's comm device crackled to life, Rix's voice cutting through the static. "Hey, head honcho, you busy basking in your newfound glory?" "Just overseeing the apocalypse's aftermath," Callum replied, a grin tugging at his lips. "You know, the usual." Well, don't get too comfortable, Rix warned. There's talk of some off-worlders wanting to visit. Diplomats, they say. Figured you'd like a heads up. Callum's mood soured a bit at that. The last thing he needed was more people in suits and ties, or whatever the alien equivalent was, coming in to shake things up just as they'd started settling down. Great. More people to disappoint, he muttered. That's the spirit, Mira said with a smirk. Just remember it's your world now, they just live in it. He shot her a look, unable to keep from laughing. Yeah, right. Just my luck to become the accidental landlord of an alien utopia. As the day wore on, the unlikely community continued to evolve. The Ithar were surprisingly open to human input, which mostly consisted of "we tried this once, and it didn't end well," or "trust us, you'll want to avoid that." Callum found himself in numerous discussions. The Ithar respected his opinion, even when he was mostly winging it. Everyone was hungry for change, and he'd given them the taste they never knew they craved. "What's next, you think?" Mira asked as they watched the sun set over a landscape that was starting to look less like a scrapyard and more like a home. "No idea," Callum admitted, his eyes on the horizon. "But I think that's half the fun." With nightfall, the day couldn't have felt more surreal. The air was filled with the hum of new energy turbines, the result of some wild collaboration between Ithar ingenuity and human improvisation. It was like they'd struck a deal with the universe. Give us a clean slate, and we'll try not to screw it up. In the central square, a makeshift celebration was brewing. The Ithar had always been fond of their rituals, but tonight was different. It was a blend of cultures, human music interspersed with Ithar chants, creating a soundscape that might be considered a cultural disaster anywhere else, but here, it was a victory anthem. Callum, dragged into the heart of it by an enthusiastic group of Ithar youths, found himself amidst a sea of faces, each one looking at him like he was their personal savior. It was both terrifying and humbling. "Any regrets?" Mira asked, appearing at his side with a mug of something that smelled suspiciously like jet fuel. "Only that I didn't think of bringing earplugs," he replied, wincing as someone started screeching into a microphone. Yet amid the chaos, there was a sense of unity he'd never imagined possible. The barriers that had once divided them, both cultural and literal, were dissolving faster than sugar in hot tea. The Ithar priest from the holy pits approached, his serious demeanor slightly softened. "Your device brought more than change, it brought understanding," Callum laughed, shaking his head. "You give me way too much credit. That thing was a fluke, a shot in the dark." "Perhaps," the priest conceded, "but sometimes it takes a fluke to guide us to the right path." As the night wore on, the celebration showed no signs of slowing. It was a chaotic dance of hope and relief, like they'd all been holding their breath, and now, finally, they could exhale. Callum found himself at the center of it all, a reluctant hero if ever there was one. His mind drifted, half wondering about those diplomats Rix mentioned. Would they see this as a model for intergalactic peace, or just another blip on the cosmic radar? "Whatever happens next," Mira said, reading his thoughts like she always did, "you've done something good here." He shrugged, a little embarrassed by the praise. "Just don't let them put my face on any currency. That's where I draw the line." Mira laughed, the sound mingling with the music and the laughter around them. "Deal." As the evening drifted into the early hours of the morning, the festival became a blur of lights and laughter. Despite himself, Callum felt a sense of belonging, a connection to this ragtag world he'd accidentally helped create. The Ithar and humans were no longer strangers forced to share the same space but partners in a new era. It was a testament to what could happen when people, or aliens for that matter, decided that maybe, just maybe, they could do better. And as the night sky began to lighten, hinting at the dawn of a new day, Callum felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. They'd done it, against all odds, and while the future remained uncertain, they faced it together. It was with this thought that he finally let himself relax, leaning back against a conveniently placed piece of scrap that had somehow evolved into a bench. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very junk that had once been a symbol of division now served as a foundation for the future. Mira settled beside him, her mechanical arm making a soft whir as she adjusted her position. "You did good, Callum," he nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, I guess I did." As the first rays of sunlight kissed the horizon, the world awoke anew. Etherian was no longer just a heap of discarded dreams. It was a place of promise, a testament to change born from chaos. And for Callum and Mira, it was home.